Welcome to Ascend Together, a live monthly webcast hosted by Ascend at the Aspen Institute. Each month, I have the pleasure and privilege of inviting extraordinary, inspiring leaders into the studio to have a conversation both about timely and enduring issues affecting our country, communities, kids, and families. My name is Ann Mosley. I'm the founder and executive director of Ascend and a vice president at the Aspen Institute. Today, we recognize that we can no longer tolerate the racial, gender, economic, and social inequities that have held our country back for way too long. We also recognize that decades before, centuries before, and beyond, that there have been leaders that have been laying a powerful foundation from which we all build upon. In today's Ascend Together webcast, we have a fantastic conversation focused on future builders, leaders meeting the moment and building pathways for kids and families and justice and opportunity. In a moment, you'll hear from three leaders, three Aspen Institute Ascend Fellows, to hear their strategies for building justice and equity, their strategies for building equitable, effective economic mobility and well-being solutions. But before we go into the conversation, I'd like to sort of share three key insights to set a little context for our conversation. First, just like for decades, people have been laying the groundwork, the framework and the foundation for leaders. Ascend at the Aspen Institute has built on the 70-year plus history of the Institute investing in values-based leaders that are addressing the most critical issues affecting society. Ascend Fellows share the North Star of creating intergenerational economic mobility and well-being that is grounded in racial equity, gender lens, and authentic respect and belief in the power of kids and families to determine their own future. Ascend Fellows steward more than $30 billion in public and private resources, and they serve and reach millions of children and families. The Ascend Fellowship is our big bet on leaders with bold ideas who are working both within and across systems and sectors to drive innovation, accelerate impact, and also bridge divides, forging new partnerships to make possibility happen. The second context I'd like to share and the intentionality is that these leaders represent major economic drivers in our economy. And we think about the economics of our society. We know it shows up in wealth and in power. And just one statistic to bring into the conversation, nearly 1%, just 1% of the $70 trillion in the wealth management industry right now is controlled by women or fund managers of color. This has a direct correlation to where and how money and capital flow, how risk is defined. A second is when we think about the care sector, made even more clearly pronounced how fragile but yet critical it is at a systems level. The childcare industry right now has a $100 billion total economic impact, and thinking about the future of early learning and care in the workforce is top of mind for us. Thirdly, when we think about the power of philanthropy, which for so long has been really the gas station, if you will, for social sector innovation and investment. So as you look and read and think about this work, we also invite you to take a look at our State of the Field report, which is really the state of the field around child and family well-being, grounded in equity and justice and opportunity, and thinking about looking for new opportunities around the power of the two-generation approach and new ideas to building family well-being. So now let's jump into the conversation as we move forward. Thank you again for joining us on Ascend Together. Let's get into the conversation. Right now, I'm going to call on our three Aspen Institute Ascend Fellows to join me in conversation right now. First is Kwame Aku, who is the CEO and chairman of the Black Star Fund. Georgia Martin, who is the Executive Director of South Carolina First Steps. Great to see you, Georgia. And then last but never least is Charisse West Scantlebury, the CEO of the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation. It is fantastic to see you all right now. And, we were chatting a little bit earlier. I could go on forever about all the accomplishments, all the change, all the good you're doing. But I actually want to give the mic to you all right now first to actually introduce yourself, like literally what calls you to the work that you're doing and why is it so important right now? Charisse, if I may, I'd love to start with you.
Hey there. Again, Charisse West Scantlebury, President and CEO of the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation. And doing this work in equity and justice is in my DNA. So I'm not sure of DNA and a calling. I'm not sure how that works. But wanting to work on behalf of kids and families, especially those that are, disadvantaged, vulnerable, whichever ways in which you describe it, has just been a part of who I am and my background. I come from Baltimore, grew up in public housing. I dedicate my career to the women of the Murphy homes, which no longer exists, but those women still are around. But the women of the Murphy homes who did all and everything they could to make sure we grew up in the best environment that we possibly could. They all had dreams, aspirations, and hopes for us. And I myself just learned that growing up there didn't necessarily mean you had to live in squalor, didn't necessarily mean it had to be bad, didn't mean it had to be crime-ridden, like none of that had to happen, but it did. And so that role of public policy and how do you change or transform those communities is what drives me and the question and my quest in my life. So it's in my DNA to find the answer to that question.
Thank you so much, Charisse. Can I pop over to Georgia real quick? And then Kwame, if you want to follow, that'd be terrific.
Thanks for having me, Georgia Miarton, and I'm the State Director for First Steps, which is exactly where I need to be because I am so deeply committed to the belief that all people have a fair chance at a good life, a good and productive life. And for many years, as Charisse knows, we worked together in Arkansas, and I had the pleasure of working with homeless families and their children. And these were people who had, in many cases, never been afforded that fair chance through difficult youths, schools that had expelled and suspended them and lost them that learning opportunity through a criminal justice system that didn't give them that fair chance, even at the most basic needs of housing. And so now I get to sit in a position within state government where I can invest in 37,000 children in their first 5 years of life, which is where 90% of the brain is developed. And so that's what calls me to this work.
Awesome. Well, I'll jump in. Thank you so much, Anne, for hosting us, and great to see my sisters, both Georgia and Charisse. This is Kwame Aku, CEO of Black Star Fund, which is a venture capital fund, and we focus primarily on Black entrepreneurs that are creating planet-changing companies to transform communities and economies. And I think for me, it's probably a fusion of a background and an experience. And that background is my father was born in a village with no running water in Ghana in 1940 when the country was still colonized, and came to the country in the early 60s, during the height of the civil rights movement and a lot of transformation that was happening in the country. And as a young child, I grew up, I was born in the projects in Cleveland. And by the time I was a teenager, my dad had 2 offices, and my mother was his business operations manager, and they built a very successful oncology practice. And so I saw firsthand what it looked like in one generation, in one lifetime, to create a life that transformed not only his life, but setting a new trajectory for his family and the progeny. The experience, honestly, was working with Prince. And I had an incredible opportunity working with him towards the latter part of his life. And one of the things, he was very distraught in the wake of Trayvon Martin being killed and George Zimmerman being acquitted. And he was asking this question around, why is it that when we see these Black kids in hoodies, we would think that they're criminals or thugs, but we could see a white kid in a hoodie and think it could be a Mark Zuckerberg and be a tech genius. And he challenged us at the time. He said, where are the Black Mark Zuckerbergs? Where are they? And those two things, I think, Anne, really were the foundations of the work that I do today. Because I went to school with the people who created Yahoo and LinkedIn and PayPal and Palantir and YouTube, and the list goes on and on and on. And at the end of the day, someone wrote a check between $100,000 and $500,000 to get those companies started. So when I looked at the inequity around the lack of representation vis-a-vis Silicon Valley, vis-a-vis venture capital, it was just putting two and two together and getting four, right? Who's making sure that these entrepreneurs are getting funded to create companies? And then people would say, well, but what does that have to do with children and families? Or what does that have to do with, racial and social economic injustice? Well, my vision was really simple. You could have someone, a Black woman, in a position that Elon Musk is in a position that Bill Gates is in a position like Mark Zuckerberg is in, and I think we would all agree, the world would look very different. And that was really the mission I was on, was to help to empower entrepreneurs who could not only just make money, but could create institutions and products that the planet would be using so they could use that influence to transform the way that we do life on this planet, like many of the folks in Silicon Valley have done, not always to the best results for children and families. But if we had different people in those positions of power and authority, my belief, and we're seeing it happen today, is that the transformation into the world that we want to see is going to be led by that group.
Really appreciate that, Kwame and Charisse and Georgia. And I think, for those of you that are listening in, you're seeing like the best and some of the most hopeful, but also high impact leadership that our country is seeking and so hungry for. And I think one of the North Stars that all Ascend Fellows share are that North Star of economic mobility, justice, and well-being for all. And Charisse, I just think, as you know, in the fellowship, having the right values, whether it's DNA or how you're built, what you're on this earth to do. When we think about what does it mean to lead from equity and inclusion and justice at the center, Georgia, from those early learning moments that are equitable and available and accessible to all, up to when you get down the road at institutions, be it Stanford or at CUNY or anywhere else, but that we're really unlocking that full potential. And I do think, I would love to, one of the big criteria for the Aspen Institute Ascend Fellowship is looking for leaders, big ideas, the mindset of imagination, impact, inclusion, and innovation. And then also really grounded in the lives of families and the strength of families and the expertise, as well as the role of kind of values like generosity. And so just kind of given that little context, and I'd be curious to hear from each of you. This has been a hell of a year and a half for our country. We've been rocked appropriately and unexpectedly, and ways that are unexpected to our core. From the pandemic to the reckoning of our history and the current realities of racial injustice and ongoing gender inequities and growing inequality. But enough of the problem. I want to get to the solution. For each of you, you have stepped up and led with such power, conviction, and courage. And I'd love it if you could, if you wouldn't mind just giving me a quick snippet of what does like unapologetic leadership look like for you? Has it looked like for you this past year? And Kwame, I'm going to switch it up and go first to you, then Georgia, and then Charisse, if I may. And so just roll along, my friends.
Sure. So what does it mean to be unapologetic? I think most of us, Anne, were unapologetic before, right? I think, which is probably how we got here. But I do think that what happened for me, I can't always speak for myself, is that the world started catching up with us. And I don't say that to grandstand. I say that to say that whether you were in the streets fighting for racial justice and equality for the last 5-10 years and feeling like for the most part that was falling on deaf ears, something changed last summer. In my world, where we were talking about making equity investments in Black founders, to date, I think there's probably only 3 funds in the entire country that focus solely on Black founders. However, in the wake, SoftBank, for example, I mean, less than a week after George Floyd was murdered, they came out and said, we're creating a $100 million fund for Black entrepreneurs. Now, it wasn't that long ago, I was sitting in the office at Aspen Ascend saying, I have this idea for 100 by 100, 100 Black fund managers managing $100 million funds by the year 2025. Now, there were some early believers, you, Ascend, the team, a handful of investors. There's some early believers back in 2018. But by last summer, that's when people really saw the light. Like, this is where we have to start putting serious capital and not just writing checks and hoping it works out, but building infrastructure around institutions with leaders who can make these investments and help these entrepreneurs to grow, to create really successful companies. So I think we were unapologetic in terms of the story, in terms of the vision, in terms of saying, we're going to do this whether you see it or not. All of that was true. I think what changed was that we then knew the world was behind us. We then knew the world was behind us, not just in letter and spirit, but when major institutions and major investors and major philanthropists make those phone calls and say, hey, we're ready to get behind you and understand how we can help because you are on to something. And we want to be a part of that something that you saw before. And I think for me, and I want to share this with you lastly, is that when we think about visionaries within leadership, I think we kind of have a tendency of romanticizing that, right? And for me, the visionary is simply somebody who sees something before other people see it. And you can't choose to see stuff, you just see it. Then you have to do something about it. We just happened to see some things early because we were part of a movement that, quite frankly, people weren't paying attention to. So we knew who the players were. We knew what was happening on the ground. We were starting to build these funds. We knew who the key players were. So for me to now see those key players who I was running with over the last 5 years, now running 20 million, 30 million, 50 million plus funds, and us collaborating together to really lay a new foundation for kind of the new economy and the new United States is very, very, very exciting.
Thank you so much, Kwame. And it has been the acceleration and the shifts, as you said, and we've talked often about this. You had one of the solutions that people were desperately seeking, but didn't have the courage to kind of go forward before.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's go to bring back Georgia, if we may, and go into the public sector system. And as Georgia knows, one of the things at the Ascend Fellowship, we've really taken a very close examination and kind of desire to unlock the potential of the public sector. I sometimes like to call it the $1 trillion sleeping giant of state health and human services agencies and investments that are a critical anchor and investment strategy for family economic mobility and well-being. And Georgia, you've been doing incredible work in South Carolina. Can you share kind of what this past year has looked like and how you've kind of just rolled up your sleeves and dug even deeper to drive for that change and kind of results in what you've learned and accomplished, most importantly?
Yeah, thanks, Ann. I want to actually go back to March of 2020. We were all here in our office in the hallways, and we realized that all of these families were going to go home and be full-time parents, and in most cases, full-time employees to their children. In many cases, they're very young children. And we knew that as the state's early childhood agency, we knew a lot about how to support parents in that critical role of being their child's first and most important teacher, but that this was a whole new ballgame for us. And so the first thing we did is we really leaned in and we dramatically increased our investment in parent education and built up a cadre of peer educators, really honoring that knowledge that families, that parents and grandparents have. And so actually deployed a cadre of AmeriCorps members who receive a stipend and a scholarship that they can use for themselves and for their children to go out and support other families who were dealing with anxiety and real fears about their young children's development during this period of COVID. I think the other thing that we had to acknowledge was that the childcare sector, which was at once being heralded as essential, was also essential on the backs of people who were not receiving the same types of benefits and supports that public school employees were receiving. So we had a childcare workforce in this country that is mostly hourly, is disproportionately Black and brown women. And they were not getting paid when childcare centers were closed. They were not receiving their benefits when childcare centers were closed, which they were all over the country, whereas their public school counterparts were. And so as a state agency, we took a big risk. We didn't have those federal dollars yet. We didn't have a dedicated state fund source, but we said we have to continue to pay our pre-K-4 childcare providers so that their team members can provide for themselves and their families. And what that did is it allowed us to very quickly reopen to sustain that infrastructure that's so needed. That when Boeing and Michelin and these manufacturers called and said, how are we going to get our employees back when they don't have childcare for their young children? When families said to us, we need care for our disabled children, we need care for our 3 and 4-year-olds, when they said that to us, we were able to really quickly pivot and respond and get those centers back up and running and reopen very quickly, actually in the summer of 2020, and do so safely and responsibly because we had taken that early, bold action. And I'm really proud to have been able to really listen and lean in on families because they are the experts in their lives.
Georgia, I'm going to ask you one really super quick follow-up, because when we think about, you keeping it really real, getting to families, and especially those that were feeling the biggest brunt of the impacts of COVID and the economic reverberations. You spoke to who's most affected. And, we know and I can feel a parenting moment maybe, but we're speaking to really the impact on Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Indigenous, like women and people of color and families of color. And those also maybe more economically in challenged settings. And then you also talked about like respecting the expertise and listening to families. When you made those changes, how have they, and are these going to be lasting changes on the culture and the system accountability in South Carolina? Like, is this going to be a change that you see as like a new way of working?
It is. And I really appreciate you calling that out. I would add, so we're in a very rural state. And I would add to that list of places and spaces where we see extreme disparities. I would add to that geographic disparity, which, a huge spotlight was shined on that during this pandemic when learning converted to remote digital learning in places where there was no broadband access. So we had families, we had parents, we had grandparents doing the lift completely on their own. And it was our job within the public sector to first acknowledge that those disparities existed before COVID, right? And to shine that spotlight and then take this moment to really do something about it. So one of the areas that I'm disturbed by, and I think all of us in South Carolina are disturbed by, is that there is a 25% gap in kindergarten readiness between children in poverty and the more affluent peers. But what we do know is that an investment in publicly funded full-day pre-K closes that gap between kids in poverty and the general population. And so here in this very conservative state, this moment of acknowledgement of the challenge that families are facing has allowed all of our leadership to come together in a bipartisan way to make statewide publicly funded pre-K available to every child who's eligible, every child in poverty all across the state. And that's unheard of. And I think it happened in part because of what we saw and the dramatic need that this pandemic surfaced.
Thank you, Georgia. Really great work as well. Let's bring up Charisse for her kind of past 2 years for what you've been leading. And I think I want to actually broaden the lens because Charisse, this is work that you've been doing, as you said, from, throughout your career. And it's been part of, just your world and your worldview. And when we think about philanthropy, you're not just given grants. You're sitting at tables with governors, national conversations, and really think about the full power of philanthropy is one theme. And the other one I would pull out is, okay, we've all heard the words like what the disparities that were laid bare. You've been focused on addressing inequality and building equity, justice at the center of all of your work. And so I'm curious to also hear your thoughts about kind of insights from the past year and a half, but in the context of where we've been, and most importantly, where are you seeing kind of the opportunities going forward from, how you've led this year really courageously and calling some real powers to the table and to be accountable.
Sure. And I want to thank Kwame and Georgia for their responses. And because it just got me thinking about, when you ask the question, what is an unapologetic leader? Like, how does that person show up? And I think of the words grit, courage, vision, and risk-taking. And the reason I start there is because not all of philanthropy is grit, courage, maybe way too much vision, not enough risk-taking, and boldness. And and to get back to something Kwame said too, that for the three of us, we were those things well before the pandemic, and the world is catching up to where we've been. I love the way that he described that, and we'd love to dig into that a bit more. So for us at WRF, we've been working on equity since we changed our vision and our strategy. We call it Our Equity 2025, and started that work in 2018. 2020 was to be a rollout year. The beauty, though, was that our board, had spent the year digging into what is equity. What are the root causes? Because really we wanted to get to what are the root causes of inequity in Arkansas. And for us, we identified things such as living wage. Arkansans simply do not make enough money to support their families. We call those ALICE families, asset limited, income constrained, employed, our ALICE families. That access to capital is another root cause of why families aren't able to thrive and get to where we need to be in terms of prosperity. Reading on grade level by age 8, right? That's our E8 initiative. Forward Arkansas, the work that we do there. Teacher prep was also identified. And then building voice of those in our state who simply don't have voice. Now, for us, that's equity, right? Because it's about disrupting those systems and funding the disruption of systems to be responsive to all Arkansans, regardless of their background, their geography, regardless, that all Arkansans have access and opportunity to good quality education, access to capital, living wage, and the like that I just described in a nutshell. So for us, it was just a matter of doing it, just simply doing it. What this past year and a half did for us in Arkansas is that we didn't have to spend the time explaining or making the case, because it became pretty clear that, workers do not make enough money, right? So what we call essential workers, our ALICE workers, like they became front and center for everyone to see. That our childcare workers, as Georgia talked about, our teachers, that dental assistants, that you'd be surprised at how many of these occupations that we have that just simply do not earn a living wage. In Arkansas, close to 50% of our families are ALICE families. They're employed, they're working, but they simply do not make enough money to support their families. And so the work that we do is on behalf of those ALICE families. And and just identifying what it is we need to do, and then just out there and taking the risks. So we fund advocacy and organizing, which is not something that many of our colleagues, at least in this region, do a lot of grant making in. That is about systems disruption, funding, movement building, and the capacity of advocates so that Arkansas does not pass policies that hurt our working Alice families. Like, you actually have to build the voice, build the movement, build the capacity so that we don't have public policy that is adverse. That access to capital, funding our community development financial institutions throughout the state to be responsive, because it was pretty clear that the PPP loans, the COVID relief loans, were not getting to communities of color at all, and were not getting to women. And so supporting our community development financial institutions to be able to do loans and partner with those small businesses so that those folk were able to, get access. Those are the kinds of things that we funded. Black and Brown Power Coalition building and the like. You don't find too many in philanthropy who truly want to fund building power, because it's fearful, it scares, it's all kinds of things. But those are the things that we've done. But that's because we are a foundation and leadership, that we got grit, we take those risks, and we have the courage to do the work.
Charisse, thank you so much for that. And I think, just pushing a little bit deeper, or just one more sort of thoughts from you about, the Ascend Fellowship is about embracing growing power and influence in service of what is just, and creating opportunities for kids and families across the board. And, kind of being courageous in the moment. And when we think about philanthropy, lots of vision. But this piece where trust is at an all-time low in our country and across institutions. And one of the pieces that I sort of break down trust, I think trust is doing what you say at a real basic level. Mm-hmm. As you talk about doing the work, being connected communities, but you also sit at many tables mm-hmm. At all levels, and varying different definitions of maybe power and influence. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you wanted to share a moment maybe of a courage, trust moment that was kind of a breakthrough for you in some of the work over the past year. I just wanted to give you space for that if you wanted to share a story.
A courage, trust moment? Wow, there have been quite a few. Well, we created the Essential Worker Justice Fund because we were learning that, especially for our Latinx, Hispanic Latinx folks, that, some who are undocumented and when you lose that job, you do not get unemployment benefits, and they weren't getting PPE equipment. They weren't getting equipment, and anyway, it was the atrocities. There are people who are going to go to hell for the way in which they treated workers in this past year, or even before then. And creating that Essential Worker Fund, while you would think it wouldn't be a big deal, right? You would think it wouldn't be a big deal. But that actually was a bit of a big deal, because we were also within that. There were some folk who were challenging they were challenging Tyson's. They were challenging Walmart. They were pushing JB Hunt. Like some of these workers were pushing these big companies. And then you have other folk who were like, those companies, they are great employers. They're doing right by their employees and the like. And then you have these other workers who are like, yeah, no, they're not. So that debate, that was a real debate. And even so much so that, my board eventually did vote on it, but there were even some on my board who voted against us creating such a fund. Then we found another investor in that fund that grew the fund. So then it grew. Then it became an issue of then nobody liked who was administering the fund, which is a whole nother set of issues, right? But nonetheless, it exists. It's doing what it's supposed to do. And what I thought would have been absolutely sure this is the right thing to do around equity and to be an equity funder, actually there was pushback around it. But ultimately we did it.
Thanks so much, Charisse. Just Powerful, powerful, powerful. And I think, bringing everybody on the together for this kind of last piece of the conversation, I think this part about challenging the status quo, no longer, we're not tolerating these kinds of gender, racial, economic inequities, or who's seen or not seen, who's valued or not valued, just so powerful. And I thought, Kwame, on that one, I just think, what you've done, Charisse just talked about it, and so did Georgia, about looking at the systems and the cross-sector approach. What you've, taken on when I talked about that, $70 billion, or $70 trillion of wealth management resources and assets. Mm-hmm. And you have this vision of 100 by 100, 100 million going to 100 Black entrepreneurs, CE ventures. You've seen a sea change, like the status quo has been shattered. And, I just didn't know whether, you had any insights that, or a story you might want to share that also might have said how you challenged or redefined risk, or even asset or strength that you also wanted to share from the private sector before we go into our last round.
Yeah, well, it's funny, Anne, because if you think about, in our world, right, in the equity world, in the venture and financing world, if you said that there was an investment thesis, well, we feel that there's a niche group of entrepreneurs that are Black women. And we have an investment thesis that says if you invest in them, they can create high growth companies that will outperform any other group. That statement would just kind of defy credulity. Right? It's like, what do you mean? Like, what's that based on? Plus, there's no history of that, right? It makes no sense. So that's on one side. On the other side, you had these dismal numbers in terms of disparities, right? And statistics are statistics, but one could roughly say that not only did you have a fraction of a % of all of the venture capital that went to Black women, you also had a situation that by 2016, only 12 African American women had raised $1 million for their ventures. So it's not dramatic to say a 400-year experience, you only had 12 that were able to do that. Now let's look at right now. An article just came out in Business Insider that said in the last year, almost 100 Black women have raised over $1 million for their ventures. And for Black Star Fund, to Charisse's point earlier, right, it's like I like to say, we can commiserate or we can create. So the fact that our fund invested over half the portfolio into Black women, 70% of the investments we've made have gone to Black women. But much more importantly, those companies are thriving and outperforming their counterparts. So what's starting to happen is not, again, Kwame saw something. No, there's a whole movement that's doing this. So what's going to happen over the next 3, 4, 5 years is not only will hundreds and hundreds of folks who had historically not been funded now be funded, not because we begged Silicon Valley to do it, but because we did it and because people believed in us and the vision to do it. Then you're going to start to get new power players on the scene. And I'm really grateful that Charisse brought up that word, right? Because I think in a lot of ways, and Charisse, obviously you're right, people are terrified of the word power. But I like to simplify it and say power is simply the ability to do something. The more power you have, the more you can do. Now, that's not just about money, but money does have a lot to do with it. So I think, and what I've seen is, again, being part of this movement early, now being one of the leaders and pioneers, locked arm in arm with other extraordinary folks that are leading these efforts, we just are going to stair step it. And when you talk about that $70 trillion, that happened over hundreds of years. I believe now we're part of a catalytic movement. It may not be $70 trillion in the next 10 years, but the reality is if you're talking about $500 billion over the next 5 to 7 years, that is now concentrated in the work that we do, you're going to have a whole new set of foundations, a whole new set of power players, whole new sets of technologies, whole new sets of ways of just doing life that are going to really change everything, not only for the country, but the United States has always been the beacon light of hope, transformation, and the future. So that's why I'm very optimistic. It doesn't mean we're not dealing with real serious issues, challenges, and problems. Absolutely. But the reality is, I think human beings and Americans, certainly the best of us usually comes out during the most challenging times.
Absolutely. Challenge, intention is where growth and rebirth happens, and possibility. So, this part, just Kwame, what you shared, and I know, Charisse, under your leadership, Winthrop Rockefeller's portfolio has invested 50% or more of your assets and resources in firms led by people of color and women. Georgia, you're taking it right to all families. As you know, the Ascend Fellowship, we founded to Kwame, like, leadership is everywhere. Leadership is ascending throughout all 50 states, tribal nations, Puerto Rico, District of Columbia. Like, the change is here. Is the world ready? We are, for Ascend at the Aspen Institute, building on the history from 1959. We call it the Aspen Institute Aspiration. That, kind of the leaders that are creating the solutions are leading with the right values to really ensure a fair, just, and equitable society, and that opportunity and well-being can go from one generation to the next with resilience and respect, is so powerful. And it's not going to be one sector, even one system or one leader. It's really building that ecosystem of leaders that are powerful and are generous and are leading with one another and together. And the Aspen Institute and the Ascend team is, as we love to say, it's all about you and each fellow, and then nothing about any of us. It's about the change we have the power and the belief to make. So on behalf of the Ascender team at the Aspen Institute, it is always our pleasure and our privilege to do this work with each of you. You inspire us every day to put that aspen leaf to work, as I say, irreverently and respectfully, but put that leaf and those roots that are woven under the ground together, so that we are really building the force in the future for all. So I just can't wait to work with Cohort 5. Can't wait to bring you all together in Aspen at some point safely in the near future. And just thank you all for the leadership that you are doing every single day on behalf of children, families, communities, reimagining sectors, our future of our country. You are the builder futures, builders of the future. So thank you, and we will see you soon.